Recording is starting now.
Terrific. Thank you, Sharon.
All right. Good afternoon. And thank you for attending this meeting of the Executive Committee of the State Bar of California Board of Trustees. Dag, would you please take the roll?
Broughton, Cisneros,
Here.
Delenn,
Here.
Duran,
Here.
Bertula, Saleg.
Here.
All right, we have a quorum, Chair.
All right. So we'll begin with a call for public comment, which will be limited to the single item on our agenda, which is approval of priorities for competitive grants to legal services to fund provisionally licensed lawyers. And so, Dag, do we have any members of the public online with us?
I do not see anybody in the attendee list, so it looks like we are by ourselves today.
All right. I have no chair's report. We have no consent items, so we'll proceed to item 3A on the business agenda, which I've already described. So let's go ahead with the presentation on that item.
Thank you so much, Chair Saleg. Chris, would you mind pulling up a PowerPoint? We do have a prepared PowerPoint that goes over much of the information that you've seen in the memo that was posted to the agenda item. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dewan Nguyen, and I am a program manager in the Office of Access and Inclusion. I also want to introduce you to my colleague, Chris McConkey, who's a senior program analyst in our office. And we just want to thank all the trustee members today for calling this ad hoc meeting. We know that you had another meeting last week, so we really appreciate your flexibility in kind of moving this agenda forward because it's on a pretty expedited schedule. Chris, can you go to the next slide? So this is a roadmap of what Chris and I plan to cover today. We're going to briefly go over the legislation that effectuates this grant program. Then we're going to talk very briefly about the State Bar Provisional Licensee Program, since you're all familiar with that. We're going to talk about kind of our projected revenue for the 2021 fee cycle as well as 2022. We're going to talk about, I'll go over our proposed requirements for the grants as well as the selection criteria and the scoring rubric. And then we'll end with a recap of the timeline and a proposed resolution for your consideration. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
All right, thank you. So Assembly Bill 3362 is the legislation from last fall that has created these grants that the State Bar is now about to administer. Specifically, it adds a section to the Business and Professions Code, and it establishes a 2-year period starting last January 1st, 2021, running through January 1st, 2023. And it's meant to cover 2 State Bar fee cycles, so 2 years worth of licensee fee statements, where it increases by $5 an existing line on the fee statement that was $45, but now for 2 years is $45. And it's what we call the opt-out donation to legal services. So if you take no action, you essentially donate now $45 to legal services, but attorneys can elect out of it. The extra $5 will create, according to the statute, competitive grants for legal services organizations, and it actually specifies that they have to be what are called qualified legal services projects and support centers that qualify for interest on lawyers' trust accounts funding, that those organizations specifically can apply for these grants to hire participants in the provisional licensure program. The provisional licensure program, as you know, is currently set to sunset on June 1st of 2022. And so the statute does make a provision for what happens after the program ends. So when there are no more, we're calling them PLLs, provisionally licensed lawyers, when those participants cease to be PLLs, the statute says whatever money is left over from this extra $5 will get distributed to the same nonprofits, but by IOLTA formula instead of by competitive awards. So I'm going to kind of pause, I think, at the end of each slide just to see if anyone has a question already before I move on, because I don't want anyone to lose their question.
Okay. So this is Sonia.
How much
Sonia?
are we, how much are we thinking to be the amount that's going to be part of this? The $5.
That's a great question. We do have a slide coming up with projected revenues. We have actual amounts for 2021 thus far, and it's about 500,000. And we are projecting a little bit more conservative for 2022. But we have a slide that has those figures.
All right, wonderful. Thank you.
Let me just let me note that Mark Broughton has joined us. Good afternoon, Mark. Nice to see you.
Good
Thank you, Sean.
afternoon, Trustee Brown. All right. And then, of course, if you come up with a question, I can always tab back to a slide. So Dwan correctly noted, I think it's the slide after this that has our projections for the amounts. And I'll spend very, very, very little time on this slide because I think you're all very familiar now with the State Bar Provisional Licensure Program. So this was more for members of the public that maybe were new to it, but it's a program that responds to the hardships on law school graduates, specifically those who graduated from law school in 2020, allows for them to provisionally practice law with a provisional license if they meet certain other requirements, including having an attorney supervisor. The most material update for these grants was the January 28th Supreme Court order expanding eligibility for the program, and this will become effective, I believe, tomorrow. So starting on February 24th, that the group of people who can apply to be provisionally licensed lawyers can now include those who scored at least a 1390 on the bar exam but didn't pass between the July 2015 and the February 2020 administrations. So the pool of potential PLLs, provisionally licensed lawyers, grew by quite a bit. I won't take any more time on this slide. I think most folks are probably pretty familiar with it, but did anyone have a question about this program? Okay. All right. Oop, wrong direction. Okay, and then here's the slide with our projections for the amounts. So the total amount that can go towards these competitive grants from 2 consecutive state bar fee cycles will depend on how many licensees stay opted in to the $45, or in other words, who choose to opt out. The 2021 fee statement has closed. Those were due on February 1st. So we know that it's about $552,000 available from 2021 for these competitive awards. So that's just from the $5 increase. For 2022, we can only project how much the $5 increase will bring in. And staff are conservative, the commission rather is conservatively projecting, when I refer to commission, it's the reference to the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission. The commission is conservatively projecting $480,000. I believe that's about a 13% decrease if memory serves me. It's the same decrease in funding that the opt-out line saw between 2020 and this year. The commission just extended it one more year. So it's assuming the decrease will be the same between 21 and 2022 because economic conditions might be similar. So if you put those two together, it's just over $1 million for awards. And this is a pure example, but $1 million would yield exactly $50,000 grants. It is not the case that the commission has necessarily recommended exactly $50,000 grants, as you'll see in a moment. The last bullet point here is that the commission recommends letting the grantees the applicants propose budgets for expenses to hire PLLs starting on January 1st, 2021, which is when the law became effective, and ending on June 1st, 2022, which is when the provisional licensure program ends. Dwan, would you add anything to the slide?
No, so we're trying really to maximize the entire period. So that's why it's a 17-month grant period. And we're letting the grantees, the applicants propose that period to be as flexible as we can.
That's great. Thank you. That's a great addition because we want to distribute as little as possible by the IOLTA formula, the sort of like provision that triggers if there's any money left over, since the commission and also staff find that the intent of the legislation is to maximize this funding for hiring PLLs. So letting the programs go back to January 1st will help them to do that. Okay. So two particularly important statutory requirements. One is that the competitive awards are limited to current qualified legal services projects and qualified support centers in California, and the Business Profession Code defines which nonprofits meet those criteria, and they're the same ones that receive our interest on lawyer trust accounts grants every year. So that's the pool of nonprofits that can apply, and they must use the funds to hire PLL. So the statute uses the language, quote, to hire, until the provisional licensure program ends, after which it gets distributed by the IOLTA formula. The commission has recommended that the applicants must have hired on or after January 1st, 2021. So this would go to hire a PLL as opposed to paying for an existing staff member who maybe was an employee before January 1st. The commission has specified that their recommendation would be that it's okay to convert a volunteer or a contractor to an employee, so that what would be material here is that they become an employee. It'd also be okay to rehire an employee who had left, which might be important for an organization that had to downsize because of economic conditions, and this would be a way they could bring back someone as an employee after January 1st of 2021. The commission recommends limiting these grants to hiring full-time employees, and the main reason for that is the commission wants to ensure that PLL hires can qualify for the full suite of benefits that programs can offer.
But just a quick note about the full-time employees. The commission is not making a recommendation or requirement in terms of hours. They're letting the applicant organization determine how many hours constitutes a full-time employee.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's also important for this next bullet point too, that the commission recommends that the PLL hire get the same first-year attorney salary and benefits that other first-year attorneys at the org. So the commission found that it would be important for the organization to follow its own existing personnel policies, its existing salary scale, maybe its collective bargaining agreement, if that would apply to them, to treat the PLL hire the same way they would treat a normal hire, and not single them out for more preferable or less preferable treatment. And then the commission recommends that the grants cover only the PLL's salary, the payroll taxes associated with that salary, and their benefits. And the reason for limiting it to those costs is to ensure that to maximize compensation, fair compensation to PLLs, to hiring PLLs. So I'll pause here to see if there's any questions on the slide. Okay. So the commission has come up with the following selection criteria. The crux of the criteria, so unlike some of the other discretionary grants that the commission and the state bar make, this one is not limited to helping particular communities of Californians, low-income Californians, or providing services in a particular area of law. So the commission had some bandwidth to decide or recommend what the selection criteria would be that would best effectuate the statute. And what they recommend is directing grants towards programs that will robustly support and supervise their PLL, where the PLL will be able to do the most high impact, meaningful work that will be a good experience for the PLL and safe for the legal services organization's clients. So what would go into that is, so they came up with 4 selection criteria, and the grant application, the RFP the prompts would track these criteria. The 4 criteria are impact, so that the applicant would need to show that how they would leverage the PLL's provisional license on a project that is well within the organization's experience and expertise, so that the organization is well situated to make use of the PLL in what might just be like a 1 year or a 1.5 year maximum 17-month position. That they're going to be able to train, mentor, and otherwise professionally develop the PLL who might have to work remotely some or most of the time. That they can have safeguards in place. So number 2, number 3 might look kind of similar. So the emphasis on number 2 is what I would call sort of like soft supervision or support, training, onboarding, professional development. Number 3 is a little bit more like hard supervision, actual oversight of work product, so that they have safeguards in place to protect the clients and the PLL through quality assurance safeguards and supervision. That might look like case review and review of written work product. And then the 4th criterion is to describe their process for locating, evaluating, selecting thoughtfully a strong and diverse pool of candidates. The commission also recommends that staff, this isn't a 5th criterion, but the commission recommends that staff use their best efforts to make grants statewide. The reason why that's not a 5th criterion is just that the commission found that it would be unfair or unpredictable to advantage or disadvantage particular applicants on the basis of where they happen to be located vis-a-vis other applicants. And so while staff will, they encourage staff to use their best efforts to make grants statewide, they didn't want to award points for happening to be the only organization to apply from a particular county, for instance. The next slide has the actual rubric, but so you can see that, but are there any questions about this slide? I do want to say special thank you to Board of Trustee member Tony for attending the Legal Service Trust Fund Commission's Executive Committee meeting on February 12th, listening in and making the very helpful suggestion that for criterion number 4, that instead of just looking at their process for locating, evaluating, and selecting strong applicants, that we include in the recommendation, looking at their process for selecting strong and looking at a diverse pool of candidates. So whereas diversity is not necessarily something the State Bar would build into the rubric as giving points for the PLL hire being diverse, it was the case the commission wanted to include making sure that the whole pool of candidates was diverse, that there was diverse outreach and recruitment for applications at the organization level. So this is the rubric. We wanted to show you the whole thing. It's a lot of text, unfortunately, but so you can see exactly how it'll look in the request for proposals. To just walk you through it a little quickly, the 4 criteria are on the upper left, and then there are 3 rows where staff will basically put check marks for either exceeding, meeting, or falling below expectations for the proposal as written.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair, I apologize. I don't think that the slide has advanced, so we're not looking at what you're describing.
Oh, thank you for letting me know.
Sure, of course.
Is everyone still seeing the selection criteria slide?
I saw the rubric slide, Chris. I don't know if everybody else did, but I'm seeing the rubric slide.
Yeah, I am too. I think Ruben, maybe your system
There we
froze.
go. Okay.
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 Sorry about that.
I'm still glad
Thanks.
you said something because I want everyone to be able to see this.
Apparently it's just me, so thank you. I apologize for interrupting.
So the
And Chris, before you go on, I just want to remind folks, Sean, you may in particular remember that a couple of years ago, a year ago, we spent some time at the board meeting looking at the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission's process for approving competitive grants. And the board had indicated at that time a desire going forward to have the Trust Fund Commission establish rubrics for evaluating the competitive grants. And so that has been done now for the partnership grants. It's been done, and it's being done here for these grants. And so this is something that the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission has built into its processes now, following that discussion in 2019 from the board in that direction to be building these rubrics in.
Yeah, that's exactly correct, Donna. And I also wanted to add that, this will be our third iteration of a discretionary grant rubric, and we've really built on kind of what we have learned, the lessons that we've learned in those two other iterations. And we have found that, it has created more consistency and transparency in our review process. So thank you, especially Chair Saleg from 2019 for providing that suggestion. And so we will kind of take our lessons, and every iteration we'll try to improve upon it.
Yes, I mean, to be clear, this is a good improvement in the commission's operations for the reasons you've mentioned. I will say it wasn't my suggestion. It was another board member. I certainly supported it, but it was another board member who was familiar with grant making and understood that this is a common and expected sort of procedure in grant making.
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, this is, Donna had mentioned that the partnership grants use a rubric now, and this rubric happens to be based on the partnership grants, the most recent rubric and concept for the partnership grants. It's a little shorter because these grants need to go out a little faster, but it's the same design. So the staff would assess whether the proposal exceeds, meets, or falls below expectations in the different selection criteria. The commission does also recommend, and I should say that those 4 criteria, if an organization exceeds expectations, it establishes a maximum base score of 100 points. The commission did want to create a category for special consideration where an organization could get from 0 to 10 extra points for focusing on a particularly important civil legal services need that exists today. So if the PLL would be helping very low-income Californians facing legal issues arising out of COVID-19, a natural disaster, or would be focusing on rural legal aid, they wanted to establish the ability to go above 100 points. So the most that an organization could get is 110 points. And that's the special consideration row near the bottom. Okay. So just I think maybe 2 more slides. So the timeline is a 17-month timeline. Again, that was the commission's and staff's solution to making sure that as much of the funding as possible could go to hiring PLLs and not get redistributed at the end. So it would start on January 1st, 2021, when the law becomes effective. It would end on June 1st, when the provisional licensure program sunsets. The table just sort of shows how kind of tight the timeline is. We want to give the organizations that apply the funding as soon as possible so they can hire PLLs and keep them on payroll for as long as possible. So we're meeting with you today. We would perform outreach, a really broad outreach for these grants, probably starting very early next week. We would have the application go live in mid-March, give everyone about a month to apply, and then staff and the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Executive Committee would work to review and approve applications in May, with hopes of making grants by the end of May, early June. The commission would want to set a deadline for successful applicants to have hired a PLL. The commission landed on July 1st, which would be about 1 month, maybe 6 weeks after they would have heard that they were a successful applicant, that they were getting the grant. And if they had yet to hire a PLL by July 1st, staff would have the opportunity to redistribute that grant to another high scoring applicant. It would give staff, the commission would give staff the flexibility to work with the successful grantee to see if they just needed a little bit more time to hire PLL, or if there was actually an issue with their being able to recruit someone altogether. But the goal of being able to maybe go to the next applicant on the list would be to ensure that the funding can go to compensate PLLs for as long as possible. The June 1st, 2022 at the end is what would trigger any return of unused funds and its reallocation by the statutory IOLTA formula. Any questions about the timeline? All right, anything you would add to this one, Dawn?
We have it covered. Thank you, Chris.
All right. Okay, and that brings us to the proposed resolution. So I guess I'll ask if there's any questions or suggestions or thoughts about any of the slides at this point, looking back on the whole presentation.
Before we go to discussion among the committee members, I see that at least one member of the public has joined the Zoom, apparently after we had the call for public comment. And so I will make another call for public comment. If anyone wants to be heard, please raise your hand through the Zoom application. Seeing no hands, then let's turn to committee members, comments, questions, discussion. I will say I want to thank staff and the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission for what is clearly a very carefully thought out proposal, and that has been the product of substantial work. And so I'm very appreciative to the commission and the staff for presenting this to us. Sounds, not hearing any. Let me check my screen.
Sean, this is Jose. I'll
Yeah.
echo your statement and I will move the resolution.
Thank you. You read my mind.
Mr. Chair, I will second the resolution. This is Ruben Duran with just one comment, and that is, I think that what we've seen and heard today from staff, thank you very much, by the way, is a really good representation of the sort of the coordination that happened between and among the state bar in dealing with the pandemic. Obviously, the working group or the committee that Highland chaired did a tremendous amount of work, and it was great to partner with the Supreme Court in getting this program put together and launched so quickly. And so I just echo the chair's thanks, and I look forward to seeing folks get some grants under this program.
Excellent. All right.
I heard a motion and a second.
Yes. Unless there's any more discussion, Dag, please proceed to take a roll call vote.
Broughton,
Yes.
Cisneros,
Aye.
Delenn,
Yes.
Duran,
Yes.
and the motion carries.
Thank you, Dag. Thank you to all the committee members for making time for this special meeting. It's a time-sensitive issue, as you have seen from the materials and the presentation, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank
everyone.
you very much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.